President-elect Donald Trump announced today on social media that he intends to nominate Jared Isaacman as the next NASA administrator. And the way this works is that the nominations are put in place and then the Senate needs to confirm them. My first thought was shock and just joy. I'm so excited for Jared. Congratulations, Jared. He is such an excellent pick that nobody was talking about. Journalist Eric Berger said that one of his space policy sources said that he was guessing it was going to be Jared Isaacman, but everybody else was guessing all these other people. I didn't put in any guesses. However, I was evaluating guesses and this one never came to mind because Jared Isaacman, by and large, is not political. He's not involved in administration except for when it comes to planning and running his own space missions. Jared Isaacman is the CEO of Shift4, which is an online payment processing company. He was also the co-founder of Draken International, which trains pilots, especially for the U.S. Air Force. He himself is a pilot. He has done air shows. He has done quite a number of feats when it comes to breaking records in aviation. But what the space community generally knows him as is the commander and funder of Inspiration4 and the Polaris missions, Polaris Dawn being the first one that was successful earlier this year. Jared is a billionaire who self-funded not only himself, but a crew on the Inspiration4 mission back in 2021. You might remember that was the first free-flying Dragon mission. It had 4 crew on board for about 3 days. Highly successful. They raised money for St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. I can't remember how much at this point, but it was something like $250 million. It was an amazing amount of money that they raised for childhood cancer. I interviewed Jared Isaacman for my book, Becoming Off-Worldly, before his Inspiration4 flight, and I was struck by how determined he was to make the mission successful. He really wanted to do this right. And therefore, he was looking ahead to not just his own mission, but any mission, any commercial mission that came after. And in fact, I got the impression when I talked to him in 2021 that he was not going to be done after Inspiration4, that he wanted to go beyond. And in fact, he did with the Polaris Dawn mission, which flew earlier this year, which conducted the first commercial spacewalk, the first commercial EVA, where he and one of his crew members stuck their heads out of the Dragon for a few minutes to test the spacesuits. It was mainly a demonstration of SpaceX's spacesuits and the ability to conduct an EVA on Dragon. And then the Polaris 2 mission is planning to go beyond that. I'm going to talk more about Polaris 2 in a moment. And Polaris 3 is planning to use SpaceX Starship. Back to the NASA administrator job, the reasons why people were not thinking about him, why I was not thinking about him, was because he's not political. We've sort of gotten used to in the past several years of politicians running NASA. So we have right now Bill Nelson, who was a congressman, then became senator, and along the lines where was an astronaut for the space shuttle program, but was primarily a politician first and foremost. And he is currently the NASA administrator. Prior to that was Jim Bridenstine under the first Trump administration, who was a political person. He considered himself actually a pilot first and foremost as well, but he was a representative from Oklahoma who became quite an excellent NASA administrator. Prior to that, we had other astronauts, Charlie Bolden, for example, a NASA astronaut. We've had other NASA astronauts as NASA administrators, but never a commercial astronaut. So that, I think, was why Jared Isaacman kind of went under the radar, is because he's not from NASA. He's never worked for NASA. He has only interacted with NASA through the SpaceX missions that he has done, which were not NASA missions. By and large, he is a non-controversial person. He is uniformly well-liked amongst the space community. He is nonpartisan. I do not see any reason why anyone would balk at this nomination except for ties to SpaceX, which is what the first thing I thought of was he has quite a bit of financial and otherwise ties to SpaceX, which might be biasing his decisions as a NASA administrator towards SpaceX. So that is going to need to be looked at. Any Senate nomination process, they're going to ask questions along those lines, but Jared seems to be a really level-headed guy where I don't think that it is going to be something that stops the process. I think that he knows that he has this big question mark when it comes to ties to SpaceX, and therefore he will do his best to make sure that he is seen as an unbiased NASA administrator if he is confirmed. Another reason this took us by surprise is because this happened so quickly. Donald Trump doesn't even take office until January, right? And so usually NASA administrators are sort of ignored until a few months into a new administration. So the fact that this nomination happened, or the announcement of the nomination happened so quickly before the swearing in of Donald Trump for his second term, I mean, like, that took us all by surprise. So in the past, there's been interim NASA administrator that has, that has held the reins and made sure everything runs smoothly until a full NASA administrator. And depending on how long the Senate confirmation process takes, we're likely to still see a NASA interim administrator. I don't foresee Bill Nelson staying on during the Trump administration at all, even temporarily. I think that because he is a Democrat, he would want to get out of there as fast as possible. Maybe I'm wrong, we'll see. But I think that we will have probably a short period of NASA interim administrator in there before Jared is confirmed. And I see no reason why he wouldn't be confirmed. Now, some questions here, right? I did mention Polaris too. So that was a bit controversial earlier this year. It was initially proposed to be a Hubble servicing mission. The Hubble Space Telescope is a phenomenal observatory, but it is old and it needs repairs and replacements of certain parts. And Jared had proposed that Polaris 2 could go do an EVA and service the Hubble Space Telescope at no cost to NASA. It would just be the risk of a private individual, or two private individuals probably, doing a spacewalk, doing a very technical, delicate work near a very expensive NASA piece of hardware, a NASA asset. So NASA decided that it did not want Jared Isaacman or anybody, any commercial company, to touch Hubble in a sense. There have been other Hubble servicing missions. They've all been done by NASA astronauts, and NASA decided that it just didn't trust a commercial astronaut to do it, which I have done another video, which I will link above, that pretty much says that that was a bad decision. NASA did not put out any kind of documentation to explain why it decided not to allow a Hubble servicing mission from commercial astronauts to take place. But basically, the gist that I get is that they just didn't trust commercial astronauts. So that might be something that changes under the Jared Isaacman NASA administrator term, or not. Maybe it's a conflict of interest and maybe he can't make decisions like that. So we'll just have to see how that goes. I have seen some pretty unfair and naive comments that Jared Isaacman's influence over NASA will just flow money to SpaceX. And I think that's probably cruel and unfair to Jared and to NASA and to SpaceX, because SpaceX has been winning contracts because they are really good at competing at contracts. And to say that, Jared is going to be heavily biased in how he conducts affairs at NASA is, I think, really unfair. It is, of course, something that's going to be questioned during this confirmation process, but we'll just have to see how he handles that. There were also some rumors floating around after the election because of Elon Musk's influence over Donald Trump that it might be that Mars gets to be back in the forefront. Before Artemis, there was a more Mars emphasis, a journey to Mars, for those of you who remember that phrase. And there was thought that because Elon Musk wants to send humans to Mars, that he would convince Donald Trump that we would not focus very much on the moon, or maybe even cancel some of the Artemis missions to the moon, and instead focus on going to Mars. And in Jared Isaacman's statement, he actually said moon and Mars. So let me read this. Americans will walk on the moon and Mars, and in doing so, we will make life better here on Earth. So that tells me that Jared does not expect to cancel any Artemis missions going to the moon, at least anytime soon. So we should still expect to have Artemis 2, Artemis 3. Now, will they be in the current configuration? Will Space Launch System survive? I have argued for many, many years that it probably should not survive. It is still very politically popular. So the way that it works within the US government is that the White House directs what it thinks NASA should do. Congress is the one that authorizes and appropriates the budget. And so it's really Congress that has control over what NASA actually does. The NASA administrator does not actually have that much control. He has influence, but he does not have control. And so to cancel any missions, that would be actually very difficult if SLS is still very popular, if other components of Artemis are still very popular within Congress. The retirement of Alabama's Senator Shelby, it has been less of a, how do I put this? SLS does not have so much of a champion because Shelby is gone, because Bill Nelson is now leaving. He was one of the originators of SLS as well. And so a lot of these original champions of SLS are gone or will be leaving. And so we're just going to have to see how long SLS lasts. I don't think it's going to last long term, that's for sure. I do think it'll probably hang in there until Artemis 3, but I have no crystal ball, so your guess is as good as mine. He only has so much influence, he only has so much power, and he needs to be the one to convince Congress to give funding. Another thing that Jared Isaacman has said in the past, mainly on Twitter and on X, is that he does not believe that we should be funneling money towards SLS or even an additional lunar lander. I'll talk about that in a moment, at the expense of science. And so that makes me wonder about the Viper mission that was canceled, that NASA canceled, that NASA recently put out a statement, which I will link in the description below, about why they decided to cancel Viper. I also have a video, which I will link above, if you want to watch that, if you want to get more information about Viper and why I believe it should not have been canceled. So that tells me that Jared Isaacman actually wants to promote science. After Donald Trump was elected the first time, that people were concerned about, what would be the focus on science? And in fact, there was a lot of attempting to cut climate science, attempting to cut education. We're going to see how much of that returns during the second Trump administration. But with Jared Isaacman as NASA administrator, I actually think that he's going to protect the science a lot more than some other nominee would. Now, getting back to the lunar landers, he'd made some statements on SpaceX Twitter in the past that he does not think that it's wise to spend money on 2 lunar landers. If you remember, NASA originally wanted to choose 2 lunar landers, but only said that they had the money to choose 1. So they chose SpaceX with the Starship HLS. And then, with a lot of pushback from Congress, mainly, NASA decided to award a second lander contract, which they originally wanted to do, and they awarded that to Blue Origin for Blue Moon. And NASA is a real big fan of dissimilar redundancy, so I actually think it's a good idea to have 2. Just look at what's going on right now with the commercial crew program to the ISS. That is SpaceX and Boeing contracted to carry crew to the International Space Station. To date, only SpaceX has been successful. Boeing has been unsuccessful with its Starliner in carrying crew successfully and returning them back successfully to Earth. Now, that might not be the best example, because in that example, SpaceX actually did really well, and if SpaceX had been the only one chosen, that would have been fine. But despite that example, I actually think it's still a good idea to have 2 just in case. And also, we don't have just one type of car or one type of plane. We have many different types. So I think it's a good idea to have more than 2. I think it's a good idea to have many different vehicles that can do very similar things, because they all bring different things to the table, and you never know what's going to happen in the future. And so the fact that Jared has said that he thinks it's a waste of money, or that money could be used better for just 1 lander and not funding a second, I don't know if that's going to carry through. The award for Blue Moon has already been given years ago. Blue Moon is actually going to be flying on Blue Origin's own dime, uncrewed, to the surface of the moon so they can prove it out. So we're just going to have to see how that plays out. There are a lot of unknowns here, so I'm not going to go into crazy speculation about what's happening. I warn you to not really trust anybody who's speculating huge amounts on what a second Trump administration is going to do with NASA, or with space in general, or what Jared Isaacman is going to do as NASA administrator. I just think that it's a fantastic nomination. I am really happy to see this put forth. It was a surprise to me. I do wonder what it means for Polaris 2 and the way that he needs to prepare. If he's going to be commander of Polaris 2, he needs to do training, right? And have his crew together. So I do wonder, is Polaris 2 now on hold until he's no longer NASA administrator? I guess so. We're just going to have to see how this all plays out. It is very, very early. So I am very excited to see how the Senate confirmation process goes. But even before that, I'm attending a conference next week in Orlando where Jared Isaacman is a speaker, and I'm hoping that he says something about this whole thing and what he might be as NASA administrator. Let me know in the comments what you think about Jared Isaacman as Donald Trump's pick for NASA administrator. Also, you can see that I only have my office here, my studio half set up. I still am missing my mic. I'm still using this external one. So bear with me as I continue to unpack and get everything set up. But I'm excited to come back to you all with a fully furnished office here, fully furnished studio. Love you all. I'm so glad to be back.